Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. September 20th, 1942, Naval Air Station, North Island, San Diego, California. Imagine gripping the controls of a machine never meant for your hands, a sleek predator of the skies, born from the enemy's blueprints. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders sat in the cockpit of such a plane, heart-pounding, fingers damp, despite the crisp ocean air sweeping in from the Pacific. What ran through his mind as he stared down a dashboard of instruments labeled in Japanese script? Could he trust the responses of this alien craft? It sent a strange cocktail of unfamiliar oils and foreign materials. Outside, the hangar bristled with armed guards. Their orders? Absolute. For what stood inside that building was not just a plane. It was a key to the enemy's aerial dominion, a treasure more precious than gold. 3 weeks it had been here, and now, at last, it would fly. Sanders eased off the brakes. The captured Mitsubishi A6M2 Model 210 began to move, gliding forward with a grace that belied its deadly purpose. The engine purred, not roared, but hummed with a deceptive smoothness. And within moments, this test flight would uncover chinks in Japan's aerial armor flaws that, once exploited, would shift the very rhythm of air combat in the Pacific. What secrets lay locked inside this bird of prey? Secrets that would ignite a revolution in American fighter tactics, that would lead to weapons capable of downing more than 5,000 enemy aircraft. The tide of the Pacific War was beginning to turn, but the turning didn't start in San Diego. It started 5 months earlier, hundreds of miles north, on a rain-drenched speck of land lost in the Aleutians. June 4th, 1942, Akutan Island, Aleutians. On that fateful day, history was being written in blood and fire. While far to the east, American dive bombers pummeled 4 Japanese aircraft carriers at midway, shattering Japan's naval juggernaut. A quieter, lesser-known drama was unfolding on an island wrapped in mist and misery. 19 years old and full of the unshakable resolve of youth, Flight Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga had launched his Zero from the deck of the carrier Ryujo. His mission? A diversionary strike against Dutch Harbor, part of Japan's plan to scatter American forces and shield their true intentions at Midway. Koga wasn't alone. At his side flew Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Suguo Shikata. Their assault was merciless. The trio descended upon Dutch Harbor like hawks, shredding an American PBY Catalina patrol bomber from the sky and ruthlessly strafing survivors in the water below. The Zero, as always, proved its worth, outpacing and outturning anything the Americans could throw at it. But war hinges on moments. One bullet, one breath, one blink too long. A single .50 caliber round, likely fired from American ground positions, tore through Koga's aircraft. The oil return line critical to the engine's delicate balance was severed. Doom was now measured in minutes. Without lubrication, the engine would seize, lock, and die. Koga radioed the news to his flight commander, his voice surely steeled by training, but how could his heart not tremble? He turned east, toward Salvation Akutan Island, a designated emergency landing site just 25 miles away. Offshore, a submarine waited, ready to extract downed pilots. As Akutan came into view, hope flickered. There, just half a mile inland from Broadbite, lay what appeared to be a perfect landing strip, a long, grassy field as inviting as any airstrip in Japan. From above, his wingman circled, watching Koga lower his landing gear for a routine wheels-down landing. Then, the terrible realization. From the sky, Shikata noticed a shimmer of sunlight dancing not on grass but on water. On his second pass, dread seized him. The field wasn't a field at all, it was a bog. The tall grass masked a treacherous soup of standing water and knee-deep mud. He grabbed his radio, his voice no doubt rising with urgency, trying to warn Koga, but it was too late. The young pilot was already committed. The wheels touched earth, and the Zero, silent, deadly, and beautiful, began its final descent into history. The wheels of the Zero kissed the grass at roughly 80 miles per hour. For a fleeting instant, everything seemed under control. A textbook emergency landing, smooth and clean. But war does not reward appearances. Beneath the lush green surface, the treacherous bog waited, hidden and hungry. The landing gear plunged into the muck like a trap springing shut. A jarring jolt followed, then the inevitable betrayal of physics. In a single heartbeat, the nimble fighter became a helpless projectile. Its tail, still carrying momentum, pitched skyward, flipping the aircraft end over end in a catastrophic cartwheel. With a bone-crunching slam, the Zero crashed upside down into the marsh. The cockpit crumpled. The life of Tadayoshi Koga ended in that instant, his neck broken on impact, death swift and final. There he hung, suspended by his harness, motionless. His flight suit was still immaculate, save for the meticulous medical taping around his torso, a silent testament to past injuries or cautious preparation for the brutal G-forces of aerial combat. His sidearm and samurai sword remained at his waist, symbols of duty, honor, and now tragedy. High above, his wingmen circled, watching helplessly. They knew their orders: destroy any downed aircraft to prevent it from being captured. Their fingers rested on triggers, machine guns locked onto the wreckage below. But the sight tore at them. The Zero lay almost unscathed, inverted in the grass like a turtle trapped on its back. What if Koga was still alive, pinned inside, clinging to life? Could they really fire on their own brother-in-arms? They hesitated. Again and again they looped overhead, trying to glimpse movement. The silence from the cockpit gave no answers, only questions. With fuel dwindling and hope in conflict with duty, they finally turned west, hearts heavy, and flew back to the carrier Ryujo. Out at sea, a Japanese submarine scoured the waters off Akutan for any sign of their fallen pilot. But fate had chosen another path. The USS Williamson, an American destroyer, forced the sub to flee. Koga and his Zero were left alone in the remote Aleutian wilderness, abandoned, forgotten, but not yet done with the war. For there, amid the fog and bogs, slept a ghost that would one day whisper enemy secrets into American ears. For 5 long weeks, the fighter rested undisturbed. Akutan Island, cloaked in near-perpetual fog, hid its secret will. The site was invisible from sea routes and standard patrols. On average, only 6 days each month offered visibility through the oppressive Aleutian haze. And with the devastating loss at Midway, Japan's carrier forces had retreated west. No search parties came. No one knew where Koga had fallen. He was simply recorded as another casualty of a war growing more desperate for Japan with each passing day. Then came a twist of fate. July 10th, 1942, lost in the unforgiving skies over the Aleutians, Lieutenant William Theas piloted his PBY Catalina patrol bomber through the mist. Navigating this region was a perilous task, magnetic compasses skewed by Arctic interference, visual landmarks swallowed by endless cloud. Theiss relied on dead reckoning, trying to piece together position and direction like a man groping through darkness. A sudden break in the clouds revealed the Shumagon Islands, at last confirmation. With bearings restored, Theiss adjusted course for Dutch Harbor. To save time and precious fuel, he cut directly across Akutan Island, and that's when fate intervened again. Machinist mate Albert Knack, serving as the plane's captain, happened to glance downward at just the right moment. What caught his eye in the marsh below seemed alien to the landscape. Sleek, unnatural, foreign. A second look. Bright red Hinomaru circles on the wings. Japanese. A zero. Theiss circled the site, heart racing, making careful notes. Could this truly be what it appeared to be? A downed enemy fighter intact? He turned back to Dutch Harbor and reported the coordinates. The response was immediate. Within hours, a recovery team landed near the crash site. What they found was beyond their wildest expectations. The Zero had struck the only patch of Akutan where the marsh was just right, soft enough to cushion the impact, firm enough to prevent the plane from being swallowed whole. The bog had acted like a giant shock absorber. A landing on rock or hard ground would have reduced the plane to twisted metal, but here it had survived. Aside from the crushed windscreen, bent propeller tips, broken landing gear, and some wing damage, the aircraft was astonishingly whole. A marvel of engineering, preserved by the Earth that had taken its pilot. Koga's body was carefully removed from the cockpit. The recovery team gave him a burial with military honors on a slope overlooking the site where he had fallen, his final resting place facing the sky he once ruled. The medical wrappings around his torso were noted, perhaps the result of old wounds or a pilot's measure to guard against the punishing turns of combat. His pistol and sword were collected not as trophies, but as vital pieces of intelligence. Then began the real ordeal, extracting a full-size fighter plane from an Aleutian swamp. For nearly 3 weeks, American servicemen battled nature itself. Wind, rain, insects, mud. Every step was a struggle. They built a rough road from logs and planks, inching the wreck over half a mile of hostile terrain toward Broad Bight, where it could be loaded onto a barge. Day by day, foot by foot, the Zero was hauled from the bog. What they were recovering wasn't just an aircraft, it was a turning point. The work never stopped, not even for the cold. Imagine trudging through perpetual dampness, breath steaming in the air, fingers numbed by wind that cut like a knife. Every morning began with frozen tools, every night ended with machinery rusting from the relentless moisture. But none of that mattered. Not when the prize in their care was the most valuable aircraft ever captured by the United States. By the end of July 1942, their Herculean efforts bore fruit. The salvaged Zero was carefully loaded aboard a cargo ship, its battered frame swaddled in precautions like a relic of priceless antiquity. It departed the Aleutians in early August, navigating through waters that had so recently boiled with the fury of war. Japanese and American fleets had clashed in these very seas. But now, under heavy secrecy, this vessel carried a different kind of weapon, knowledge. On August 1st, the Zero reached Seattle. There was no time to rest. The aircraft was immediately transferred to a barge bound for Naval Air Station North Island, near San Diego. Mid-August, under tight security, it arrived. From the moment the Zero touched Californian soil, it became the most closely guarded machine on American turf. Military police stood watch around the clock. This wasn't just a captured enemy plane. It was a blueprint, a vulnerability, a revelation. Souvenir hunters, curiosity seekers, and even overeager officers were kept at bay. This aircraft had a destiny. News of the capture coursed through the Navy's aviation circles like electricity. At last, at long, long last, they had the chance to dissect the mystery that had haunted them since December 7, 1941. The aircraft that had reigned supreme at Pearl Harbor would finally be laid bare. Navy Captain William Leonard, a man destined to command a carrier division in the Pacific, later described the Zero as a treasure that unlocked so many secrets at a time when the need was so great. And for Marine Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Walsh, future ace, with 21 confirmed kills. The lessons learned from this aircraft were not just technical, they were personal. Knowing what to do with a Zero on my tail, he would say, saved my life more than once. The urgency was palpable. Every day the Zero remained grounded was another day American pilots flew into battle at a disadvantage. The race was on. Crews worked around the clock, balancing painstaking documentation with rapid repairs. They logged every rivet, every joint, every hidden panel, while simultaneously coaxing the broken bird back into flight-worthy condition. And as the pieces came together, revelations emerged. One engineer compared the Zero to a fine Swiss watch, delicate, precise, elegant in its deadly purpose. Flush rivets across the skin, guns embedded cleanly into the wings to reduce drag. The Japanese hadn't just built a fighter, they had crafted an extension of the pilot himself. Inside the cockpit, the instrument panel spoke volumes. No fluff, no distractions, just the essentials, arranged for lightning-fast awareness. Need to access internal systems? No tools required, just a push on a marked panel and the latch would spring open. Field maintenance became a matter of minutes, not hours. The entire airframe could be disassembled and rebuilt using only a basic toolkit. It was a design tailored for war in the remotest outposts of the Pacific. As the team weighed the aircraft, the numbers stunned them. Fully loaded, the Zero came in between 5,300 and 6,165 pounds, nearly 2,000 pounds lighter than the American F4F Wildcat. Where had Japan saved so much weight? The answers were as daring as they were dangerous. There was no armor shielding the pilot, none, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Even the airframe used just enough material to survive anticipated stresses. No extra margin. Everything that could be stripped away for the sake of agility had been. This was a machine designed to win by not getting hit. Where American design emphasized survivability and strength, the Zero wagered everything on maneuverability. The more they studied, the more secrets unfolded. The power plant, a 14-cylinder Nakajima Sakai radial engine, produced about 950 horsepower. It used a float-type carburetor, a detail that would later prove crucial in combat. The wings? They folded manually for tight storage on carriers, no hydraulics, no extra weight. Control surfaces were wrapped in fabric over metal frames, another nod to efficiency. And yet, for all its lightness, the Zero packed a fearsome punch. 2 7.7mm machine guns fired through the propeller arc, while 2 20mm cannons sat in the wing's formidable armament for such a nimble airframe. The restoration raced forward. By September 20th, just 41 days after the Zero arrived in San Diego, it was ready. The transformation was complete. The shattered windscreen had been replaced. The vertical stabilizer and rudder had been repaired. Wing tips, flaps, landing gear all restored or rebuilt. Even the original three-blade Sumitomo propeller was salvaged and carefully redressed for flight. The plane now bore American colors, its red rising sun insignia painted over with the blue and white star of the U.S. Navy, a wolf in sheep's clothing, and in the cockpit sat Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders. He had studied the Zero obsessively all week, poring over its systems, committing its alien controls to memory. He rehearsed each movement, every switch, every gauge. But now, sitting inside, fingers curled around the stick, he was about to cross a threshold few ever had, piloting the very enemy machine that had haunted the Pacific skies for nearly a year. A test pilot seasoned and skilled, Sanders still faced the unknown. Intelligence reports and combat accounts painted a vague picture, but no American had yet felt the Zero's soul through its controls. That was about to change. If the intelligence reports were right, the Zero was an airborne phantom faster, higher climbing, and tighter turning than any fighter America had yet put in the sky. But what if those reports were wrong? Worse still, what if the aircraft, despite its pristine restoration, hid unseen flaws from its crash? These questions loomed large in Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders' mind as dawn broke on September 20th, 1942. For the first time, he climbed into the Zero's cockpit not as an analyst or mechanic, but as a pilot, a test pilot facing the unknown. The engine, coaxed to life by the ground crew, responded instantly, smooth, steady, confident. The restoration team's painstaking efforts had not been in vain. Sanders eased the aircraft onto the runway, every motion watched by a silent crowd of engineers, naval officers, and intelligence officials lining the tarmac and peering from the tower. The moment of truth had arrived. Throttle forward, the Zero surged ahead with a surprising eagerness, like a racehorse suddenly freed from the gate. The ground roll was brief, the takeoff brisk. It climbed like nothing Sanders had flown before, eager to soar, as if impatient to return to the skies it once dominated. For the next hour, he flew it hard. Altitude climbs, power settings, stall tests, loops and rolls. Sanders methodically mapped the outer edges of the Zero's performance envelope, but it didn't take long for the aircraft to begin giving up its secrets. Immediately apparent was the fact that the ailerons froze up at speeds above 200 knots, Sanders later wrote, making rolling maneuvers at those speeds slow and requiring much force on the control stick. That single observation would become a turning point in aerial strategy. At lower speeds, the Zero performed with balletic grace its agility exactly as Japanese pilots had claimed. But above 200 knots, around 230 mph, the flight control surfaces, especially the ailerons, became stiff and unresponsive. Why? The answer was in the fabric. The Zero's control surfaces, covered in fabric rather than metal, ballooned under the pressure of high-speed airflow. At those speeds, rolling the aircraft became physically demanding. American fighters, built with sturdier metal-covered control systems and often boosted with hydraulics, retained full authority even when diving at breakneck velocity. But that wasn't all. During negative G maneuvers, when Sanders pushed the stick forward sharply, forcing his body to float in the cockpit, the Zero's engine sputtered and died, starved of fuel. The cause? The float-type carburetor, engineered for level or positive G flight, simply couldn't deliver fuel properly under sustained negative acceleration. The engine would restart as soon as G-forces stabilized, but for a few seconds, the Zero became little more than a glider. Tactically, it was a revelation. American pilots, being outmaneuvered and unable to escape a pursuing Zero, now had their answer. Sanders reported, "Go into a vertical power dive, using negative acceleration if possible, to open the range while the Zero's engine was stopped by the forces involved. At about 200 knots, roll hard right before the Zero pilot could get his sights lined up." This wasn't just analysis. It was a survival manual, a blueprint for turning the hunter into the hunted. Over the next 25 days, Sanders flew 24 more test flights in the Zero, peeling back layer after layer of its secrets. He experimented at different altitudes and configurations, pitting the aircraft in mock dogfights against American fighters, including the F6F Wildcat. The results painted a nuanced portrait. Despite battlefield reports claiming otherwise, the Zero's maximum speed was slightly lower than the Wildcat's. Sanders guessed that extra weight from replacement parts during restoration might have impacted performance. But the Zero still possessed strengths that no American plane could match at the time. Range, a staggering 1,900-plus statute miles, enough to stay airborne for 6 hours, allowing Japanese pilots to escort bombers, patrol oceans, or strike distant targets from carriers without refueling. Climb rate, the Zero could reach 20,000 feet faster than the Wildcat could climb to 15,000. In vertical engagements, it could dictate altitude and pace. Turning radius, in slow-speed turning combat, the Zero could complete a full circle before the Wildcat had finished 3/4. This agility explained Japan's early dominance in dogfights. But the brilliance came at a price. The same design choices that gave the Zero its ethereal maneuverability, its light construction, lack of armor, absence of self-sealing fuel tanks, made it painfully fragile in combat. Hits that American planes could endure would prove fatal to a Zero. One tracer round in the right spot, and it would go up like tissue in flame. The balance was clear now. Japan had built a masterful duelist, but one that could not afford to be hit. The engineers at Wright Field didn't just restore and fly the Akutan Zero, they tore it down, bolt by bolt, and studied it with forensic precision. Metallurgical analysis revealed something striking. The Japanese had used aluminum alloys of impressive quality, but they had applied them in thicknesses so minimal, American designers were stunned. It wasn't that the materials were weak. It was that the Zero had no margin for error. Every ounce had been shaved away in pursuit of agility. In the hands of a Japanese ace, it was a scalpel. But in combat, a single wound could be fatal. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, armed with data from his 25 test flights, compiled a final report that didn't just explain the Zero, it dismantled its myth. This wasn't academic analysis. This was actionable intelligence, forged in air and steel, and it would save American lives. His conclusions were clear and brutally practical. Never engage a Zero in a low-speed turning dogfight. That's its arena, its kingdom. Use high-speed diving attacks where American fighters retained control and the Zero did not. If pursued, dive steeply, preferably with negative Gs, to kill the Zero's engine, and at around 200 knots, perform a hard right roll at high speed. The Zero simply couldn't keep up. America's fighters, with their heavier armor and rugged construction, could absorb punishment the Zero could not. The key was not to match the Zero's finesse, but to survive its first strike and hit back harder. And tactics had to change too. Gone were the lone duels of heroic fantasy. Sanders advocated for team tactics, wingmen working in tight coordination, attacking together, covering each other's blind spots, forcing the Zero into defensive positions where its advantages vanished. These findings didn't gather dust on a shelf. They moved through the fleet like wildfire. Within weeks, every combat squadron, every flight school, every pilot instructor had copies of Sanders' conclusions. Training manuals were rewritten. Simulators and mock combat drills now taught the high-speed dive and hard roll maneuver as a standard escape technique. And something else began to shift, something invisible but profound: morale. For 8 long months, American naval aviators had faced a seemingly invincible enemy. They watched the Zero outturn, outclimb, and outrange every fighter they had. Some pilots whispered of it like a ghost. Others developed a quiet fear they dared not speak aloud. The official tactic until now had been brutal in its simplicity: run away. But now they had a playbook. They had knowledge. The myth of the Zero began to crack. Yes, it was still deadly, but it was no longer untouchable. It could be beaten. And yet, perhaps the Akutan Zero's greatest legacy wasn't even tactical. It was technological. Unbeknownst to many, the seeds of the next great American fighter had already been planted even before Koga's crash. On the other side of the continent, in Bethpage, Long Island, the engineers at Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation were hard at work on the next generation of naval fighter, the aircraft that would eventually be known as the F6F Hellcat. The connection between Koga's Zero and the Hellcat has sparked decades of historical debate. Some argue the Hellcat was directly influenced by the Zero's capture. Others point out that development had begun months earlier. But the truth lies, as it often does in war, somewhere in between, where timing, adaptation, and urgency intersect. January 1942. Leroy Grumman sat behind his desk in Bethpage, poring over early design drafts. The Navy wanted something better, something to replace the Wildcat, which was now proving overmatched in nearly every Pacific engagement. The design on Grumman's desk, a scaled-up Wildcat, more muscle, more speed, but built on the same foundation. A good start, not enough. The Wildcat had fought valiantly, but combat reports were grim. The Zero bested it in turn rate, climb rate, range you name it. The engineers, led by Jake Swerble and Bill Schwindler, had done all they could with the Wildcat's basic DNA. But something radically better was needed, and fast. The original prototype of the Hellcat, designated XF-CF-1, was built around the Wright R2600 Cyclone engine, putting out 1,700 horsepower, an improvement over the Wildcat's 1,200 HP Pratt & Whitney R1830. But was it enough? Grumman didn't think so. And then came the Zero delivered by chance, salvaged by grit, and revealing its soul to American hands. Whether or not the Hellcat's design was altered because of the Akutan Zero or simply enhanced by what it confirmed doesn't really matter. What matters is that the intelligence flowed, and Grumman listened. They adapted. They re-engineered. The Hellcat wasn't just a response to the Wildcat's limitations. It was an answer to the Zero. The XF-6F-1 Hellcat wasn't born in reaction to Koga's captured Zero, but its evolution was undeniably shaped by it. Grumman had been laying the groundwork for the F6F since mid-1941. The formal contract was signed on June 30th, nearly a year before the Akutan Zero came to rest in that Aleutian bog. And from the moment the ink dried, Grumman engineers understood the stakes. The war in the Pacific wouldn't be won by battleships or bombs alone. It would be decided in the air. Throughout early 1942, Grumman's design teams raced against time. Working hand in hand with the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, they adjusted plans based not on speculation, but on first-hand feedback from the front lines. Every pilot returning from the Pacific brought back more than scars and stories. They brought intelligence, and Grumman was listening. One visitor in particular left a deep impression. On April 22, 1942, a mere 6 weeks before the Battle of Midway, Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare arrived at the Bethpage facility. O'Hare had just returned from the crucible of combat, where he had single-handedly defended the carrier Lexington against waves of Japanese bombers, an act of heroism that earned him the Medal of Honor. And he didn't arrive empty-handed. He came with hard truths. The Zero, O'Hare reported, was not merely agile, it climbed better than seemed physically possible for its engine class. It could turn tighter than any American aircraft in the sky. And it was faster than previously believed. The Wildcat, while sturdy and dependable, simply couldn't keep pace. O'Hare's message was blunt. Give us a plane that will go upstairs faster. That very sentiment had been echoed verbatim the day before, when O'Hare met with President Franklin D. Roosevelt during his Medal of Honor ceremony. The Commander-in-Chief had asked, "What do you need in a new fighter?" O'Hare, still wearing the grit of battle, gave him one sentence: "A plane that will go upstairs faster." Grumman's engineers took it to heart. So did the Bureau of Aeronautics. Lieutenant Commander A.M. Jackson, one of the Navy's liaisons to Grumman, pushed for a pivotal change. Raise the cockpit, mount it higher in the fuselage, angle the forward fuselage downward, improving forward visibility over the nose. Jackson put it plainly, you can't hit what you can't see. These changes were incorporated immediately, weeks before anyone had ever heard of a Kutan. And then, a truly defining decision. On April 26, 1942, just 5 weeks before Koga's crash, the Bureau directed Grumman to replace the F6F's engine. The original design was centered around the Wright R2600 Cyclone, a 1,700 horsepower radial. But based on combat feedback and pilot recommendations, that simply wouldn't cut it. The Navy wanted more. They turned to the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp A 2,000 horsepower, 18-cylinder engine, already powering the F4U Corsair and the P-47 Thunderbolt. The switch represented a 50% increase in power over the original design. It also meant redesigning nearly the entire aircraft. Grumman reworked the engine mounts, cooling systems, and internal structure to absorb the additional torque and power. It caused delays. But the payoff? A projected 25% performance boost, enough to finally challenge the Zero in its own domain. Meanwhile, the prototypes rolled out. On June 26, 1942, test pilot Bob Hall took the first F6F-1 into the air. It still carried the Cyclone engine and handled well, but the power gap was obvious. On July 30, 1942, the second prototype, the XF6F-3, now fitted with the R2800 Double Wasp, made its maiden flight. The transformation was immediate. It didn't just match Grumman's expectations, it exceeded them. The Hellcat now had the speed, climb rate, and agility needed to face the Zero and win. All this happened before Koga's Zero had even been fully recovered, let alone flown. But when the Akutan Zero finally arrived in San Diego in mid-August, it didn't just confirm what Grumman had already done, it supercharged it. Detailed performance data from Sanders' test flights began pouring into the Bureau of Aeronautics and Grumman within days. Real-world proof, charts, flight logs, comparative analysis, a clear picture of what the Zero could do, and just as importantly, what it couldn't. Grumman engineers absorbed this intelligence like a sponge. Even as production ramped up, they continued refining the Hellcat, tweaking control surfaces, adjusting weight balance, calibrating cockpit visibility, reinforcing weak points, fine-tuning armament configurations. Every line on every blueprint became a chess move in the war above the Pacific. The result? A fighter that wasn't just engineered to defeat the Zero on paper, it was born to kill it. The Akutan Zero hadn't yet flown when its panels were first pried open and studied under American hands, but even before Eddie Sanders took it into the sky, it had already begun whispering secrets. Its construction, its weight, its armament, and most of all, its design philosophy. These clues arrived at a pivotal moment. The Hellcat's basic configuration was already drafted. The mighty R2800 double wasp engine had been selected. The prototypes were undergoing test flights. But crucially, full-scale production had not yet begun. There was still time to adjust, time to improve. At Grumman, every engineer dropped what they were doing and devoured the intelligence from the captured Zero. They weren't simply trying to match it. They were determined to defeat it, utterly and without compromise. The numbers alone told the story. The Zero's weight, fully loaded, hovered between 5,300 and 6,100 pounds. The F6F Hellcat would weigh more than 12,000 pounds, double. That staggering weight penalty seemed insurmountable on paper, but not to Roy Grumman, the company's founder and visionary. Studying the data from the Zero's autopsy, he made a critical, defining decision. Yes, Grumman fighters would be heavier, but they would be tougher, more powerful, and far deadlier. Unlike the Zero, which traded protection for agility, the Hellcat would carry both sword and shield. "We can match them," Grumman declared, without sacrificing the pilot. This ethos shaped every element of the Hellcat's final design, built for survival. The F6F was a brawler designed not to dance, but to fight and live. Armor plating was mounted behind the seat to protect the pilot's back. A bulletproof windscreen shielded the cockpit from frontal attacks. Self-sealing fuel tanks replaced the Zero's paper-thin bladders. These could take hits and continue functioning, extinguishing flames before they consumed the aircraft. The airframe was reinforced throughout, designed to absorb shrapnel, gunfire, and the brutal stress of hard carrier landings. The Hellcat was not built to be delicate. It was built to come home, turning weakness into superiority. As test flights continued in September and October, the Zero's flight characteristics revealed specific vulnerabilities. Grumman acted quickly to ensure the F6F would not share them. The Zero's ailerons, as Sanders had discovered, became nearly immobile above 200 knots, a deadly flaw in high-speed maneuvers. Grumman's answer: hydraulically boosted, metal-covered ailerons on the F6F. These provided full roll authority at all speeds, even in steep dives where the Zero locked up. The Zero's engine, dependent on a float-type carburetor, failed under negative GSA flaw that left it powerless in certain evasive maneuvers. The F6F? It used a pressure carburetor, ensuring continuous fuel flow even in inverted dives or rapid nose-down acceleration. Hellcat pilots could dive away from a Zero without their engine coughing or stalling. Exactly the maneuver Sanders had used to escape the Zero in test conditions. Structurally, the F6F was built to withstand 9 Gs of positive acceleration and 6 Gs of negative far beyond what the Zero could endure. That meant Hellcat pilots could push the airframe into extreme turns and dives without fear of snapping wings or collapsing tail sections. Any Zero pilot who tried to follow risked structural failure. From doctrine to design, this wasn't theory, it was transformation. Every scrap of data from the Akutan Zero, every insight from Sanders' cockpit notes was studied, debated, and folded into the Hellcat's final blueprint. The wings, for instance, were given a completely new airfoil and control surface design, distinct from the older Wildcat. These changes were purpose-built to optimize high-speed handling, not just maneuverability. It was a different philosophy not to outturn the Zero, but to outlast, outclimb, and outkill it. By the time the F6F reached the production line, it wasn't just a new fighter. It was a calculated answer to Japan's greatest weapon. The Hellcat was no longer just a concept. It had become a weapon, and its claws were sharp. To match the threat posed by the Zero, Grumman engineers went further than just power and protection. They turned the F6F into a flying gunship. Where the Wildcat had mounted 450 caliber machine guns, the Hellcat carried 6, a formidable armament package of 6. 50 caliber Browning M2s, all mounted in the wings, capable of tearing a fragile Zero to ribbons in a single burst. Later, models offered a mixed armament, 2 20mm cannons alongside 4 50 caliber guns, amplifying both range and punch. The result? Devastating firepower. American pilots could strike from range, overwhelm in close, and withstand return fire thanks to the F6F's armored frame. The aircraft wasn't just strong, it was lethal. But brute force wasn't enough. Visibility saved lives, and Grumman knew it. The F6F's cockpit was designed with combat awareness in mind. The pilot sat high, with a canopy that offered superb sight lines in every direction. This directly addressed Lieutenant Commander A.M. Jackson's now famous warning, "You can't hit them if you can't see them." And pilots weren't flying alone anymore. The Hellcat's configuration supported mutual support tactics like the thatch weave, a defensive maneuver relying on visual contact and coordination between wingmen. The aircraft's visibility enabled these tactics, making the F6F not just a solo predator, but part of a deadly pack. The first roar, October 3, 1942. On October 3rd, just 2 weeks after Sanders concluded his test flights in the Akutan Zero, the first production F6F-3 took to the skies. That timing was no accident. Grumman had intentionally delayed production until they could incorporate every shred of intelligence design refinements, tactical insights, performance tweaks gleaned from the Zero and Sanders reports. Was the Hellcat designed because of the Akutan Zero? No. The core design was already locked in before Koga's fateful crash. The engine change to the R2800 had been made in April 1942, months before the Zero was found. But the data from Akutan sharpened the blade. It helped turn the F6F into a weapon of precise vengeance. Into the fleet, early 1943. By February 1943, the first operational F6F-3s were delivered to Fighting Squadron 9, VF-9, embarking aboard the carrier USS Essex for shakedown cruises and training. The pilots, many of whom had spent months flying the rugged but outclassed F4F Wildcat, were stunned. It was like stepping out of a pickup truck and into a sports car, one pilot recalled. The Hellcat climbed faster, flew farther, hit harder, and gave its pilots unmatched confidence. Its stability and simplicity were no accident. Grumman had built it for war, and for the reality that many aviators were young and freshly trained. The F6F had no tricky habits, no quirks that punished inexperience. It was docile at low speeds, forgiving of mistakes, and remarkably easy to land on a carrier, the ultimate crucible of naval aviation. The reinforced landing gear, inherited from lessons learned on the Wildcat, could shrug off hard deck impacts. The wide-track gear prevented nose-overs. The responsive controls allowed precision even during the hair-raising final approach. A factory that never slept, and the scale, unprecedented. Grumman constructed an entirely new facility at Bethpage, Long Island, solely for F6F production. The first Hellcats rolled off the line before the buildings were even finished. By 1944, Grumman was producing 644 Hellcats per month, an average of 1 per hour, a pace never equaled by any single-engine fighter in history. Each aircraft required 20,000 individual parts, sourced from hundreds of subcontractors across the country. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines, assembled in 3 separate plants, were shipped to Bethpage with clockwork coordination. Behind this miracle of logistics stood Jake Swerble, Grumman's quiet genius of production, who choreographed this industrial symphony with unmatched precision. Many factory workers had never even seen a plane before the war, yet they helped build the most successful carrier fighter of all time. Between the first production flight in October 1942 and the war's end in November 1945, Grumman would build a staggering 12,275 Hellcats, all from that single factory complex. Baptism by fire, August 31st, 1943. The F6F's combat debut came on August 31st, 1943, in a carrier raid on Marcus Island, 15 months after Koga's Zero fell from the sky and 11 months after Sanders' first test flight. Fighting Squadrons 5, VF-5, and 9, VF-9, launched from USS Yorktown and Independence. The result? A one-sided massacre. No Japanese fighters even made it airborne. Several were caught and destroyed on the ground. 2 Hellcats were lost, but to anti-aircraft fire, not enemy fighters. In air-to-air combat, the Hellcat had arrived, and it owned the skies. Over the following months, the F6F became the dominant fighter on U.S. fleet carriers, phasing out the Wildcat on large carriers, while Wildcats continued service on smaller escort carriers. By early 1944, the tide had turned. The F6F Hellcat now equipped 15 carrier fighter squadrons, dominating the decks of the Pacific Fleet. It had become more than just a weapon, it was doctrine in motion, an aircraft whose every mission reflected the hard-earned lessons of the Akutan Zero. Pilots were no longer guessing. They knew. They were taught explicitly not to engage the Zero in slow-speed turning fights unless they had the altitude or numerical advantage. Instead, the F6F emphasized energy fighting, high-speed, high-altitude slashing attacks, diving like hawks, loosing a deadly burst, and zooming back to altitude before the more agile but slower Zeros could react. And if they were attacked, they wove. The legendary Thatch Weave, developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch before the Zero was even captured, had become the standard defensive maneuver across all Hellcat squadrons. Pilots flew in pairs, weaving back and forth. If a Zero latched onto one F6F, it would immediately find itself flying into the guns of the other. The tactic neutralized the Zero's greatest strength, its tight turning radius, by forcing it into head-on engagements, where the Hellcat's armor, firepower, and protection reigned supreme. Hellcat pilots were drilled to dictate the fight. If the conditions favored them, they struck. If not, they disengaged, using superior speed, climb rate, and endurance to reposition and attack from a new advantage. November 23, 1943, the Battle of Tarawa. The theory was about to meet its greatest test. Over the beaches of Tarawa, during the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, Hellcats from the carrier USS Essex met their first true trial by fire against a large formation of Japanese Zeros. 30 Zeros rose to meet them. What followed was a violent ballet across the skies. But when the smoke cleared, the results were staggering. 30 enemy fighters destroyed, 1 F6F lost. The Battle of Tarawa was the proof of concept, a live-fire demonstration of how aircraft design, tactical training, and combat experience, all informed by the Akutan Zero and Sanders's test flights, could completely overpower the once dominant Japanese aerial threat. Young, relatively inexperienced American pilots had met seasoned Zero veterans and crushed them. For the Americans, the victory was validation. The F6F worked, the training worked, the tactics worked. For the Japanese, it was something far worse, a realization that their time of air superiority was over. But Tarawa was only the beginning. June 19, 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot Battle of the Philippine Sea. If Tarawa was the proof, the Philippine Sea was the coronation. West of the Mariana Islands, Task Force 58 assembled 15 American carriers, including 7 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, all brimming with F6F Hellcats. Across the water, the Japanese brought their largest carrier force since Midway, 9 carriers, supported by dozens of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, and from those decks, they launched wave after wave after wave. The first Strike 69 aircraft never reached the American fleet intact. 42 were shot down before they got close. The rest met a storm of anti-aircraft fire and a wall of Hellcats. They accomplished nothing. The second wave came, 107 aircraft. 97 were shot down before they could even mount an attack. By the end of the day, Japanese carriers had launched 370 aircraft. Only 130 returned. The Americans lost just 23 to 30 planes, and most of those pilots were rescued from the sea. The Hellcat had become a sword and shield in the same airframe hunting Japanese bombers and fighters, defending American carriers and intercepting enemy waves at altitude before they ever reached the fleet. The battle earned a name for its lopsided outcome, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Its strategic impact was devastating. The carrier air groups, painstakingly rebuilt after Midway, wiped out. The experienced flight instructors who trained Japan's elite, dead. The aircraft Japan had hoarded for its decisive battle, gone. The F6F Hellcat, operating at peak effectiveness, had not just defeated Japanese naval aviation, it had obliterated it. By mid-1944, the F6F Hellcat had become more than just a weapon. It was the embodiment of American air power. Fast enough to chase down fleeing Zeros, armed heavily enough to win any head-on engagement, and most crucially of all, so forgiving and easy to fly that even newly minted pilots could step into the cockpit and survive their first taste of combat. That last point, pilot accessibility, became a decisive strategic advantage. The United States, with its vast industrial base and training infrastructure, was producing combat pilots faster than Japan could replace their losses. The F6F allowed these fresh aviators to enter the fight with confidence and survivability. It didn't demand mastery, it gave margin for error. Japan, by contrast, was crumbling. Fuel shortages and the loss of experienced instructors had gutted their aviation pipeline. By late 1944, new Japanese pilots were being sent into combat with barely a third of the flight hours their American counterparts received. The result was devastating. Every battle drained Japan's remaining experience, while American losses were quickly replenished from a fire hose of well-trained replacements. The technical superiority of the Hellcat, combined with the shrinking skill of Japanese pilots, created a downward spiral, a death spiral, for Japanese naval aviation. The Hellcat expands its arsenal, specialized variants. The Hellcat's contributions didn't stop with air superiority. Its versatility allowed it to evolve into multiple specialized roles, transforming it into a true multi-role aircraft. Night fighters F6F 3N and F6F 5N. These versions were equipped with radar pods mounted on the starboard wing, allowing Hellcat pilots to intercept Japanese bombers under cover of darkness. While the radar reduced top speed slightly, the trade-off proved worthwhile. These night fighter Hellcats scored numerous kills, breaking the back of Japanese night raids that had once seemed unstoppable. Reconnaissance F6F3P and F6F5P. Hellcats modified for photographic reconnaissance replaced guns with high-speed cameras conducting critical missions deep into Japanese territory. Their speed and range allowed them to fly far, gather intelligence, and return before enemy fighters could intercept. Fighter bomber, later F6F5 variants. The Hellcat was further adapted to carry 2,000-pound bombs on a centerline rack and rockets under the wings. With this loadout, the Hellcat provided precision close air support for U.S. Marines and Army forces leveling bunkers, shattering artillery positions, and mauling Japanese troop concentrations with aerial firepower, far more accurate and mobile than naval artillery. The record that defined a generation. By the end of the war, the Hellcat had carved a record that no other American fighter before or since has matched. 5 263 enemy aircraft destroyed in Pacific air-to-air combat by U.S. Navy and Marine Corps pilots. An additional 60 kills in other theaters, 5,223 total victories, including those scored by the British Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm. And against that staggering tally, just 270 Hellcats lost in air-to-air combat. That's a kill-to-loss ratio of 19.1 overall against the Zero specifically, a 13.1 ratio. These weren't just statistics. They were the result of superior aircraft design tactical doctrine rooted in the Akuten Zero's secrets. An overwhelming edge in pilot training and experience, the aces of the Hellcat. No other Allied fighter produced more aces than the F6F Hellcat. Between 305 and 307 Navy Hellcat pilots achieved ace status, 5 or more victories, depending on how shared kills are counted. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, scored all 34 of his kills flying the Hellcat. By war's end, Japanese pilots knew exactly what the F6F meant. American intelligence began noting signs of zero fatigue among enemy aviators, a psychological defeat. Japanese pilots would often dive away, flee into cloud cover, or avoid combat altogether. When Hellcats were spotted, they knew the odds. They had seen the consequences. By 1945, the role reversal was complete. In 1942, American pilots ran from Zeros. By 1945, Zeros ran from Hellcats, the legacy of the Akuten Zero. The full impact of the Akuten Zero cannot be measured in tonnage, sorties, or statistics, but its influence is undeniable. It provided the first complete look at Japan's top fighter. It allowed Eddie Sanders' test flights, which revealed specific actionable weaknesses. It informed tactical doctrine, from dive escapes to high-speed roll advantages. It helped refine the F6F Hellcat at a critical point, before full production began. Most importantly, it shattered the myth of invincibility that surrounded the Zero. Once, the Zero was a phantom, unbeatable, untouchable. But after Akuten, it became just another fighter and one with flaws. The Hellcat, born of urgency and refined through insight, would become the executioner of the Zero's legacy, a machine designed not to match the enemy, but to outlast, outgun, and outfight it at every turn. The transformation was complete, and the skies belonged to the Hellcat. By early 1945, the Hellcat had done more than dominate the skies. It had become the cornerstone of an integrated war machine: aircraft, tactics, training, industry, all working in concert to overwhelm Japanese aviation in a way that was both relentless and irreversible. And while the tactics American pilots employed weren't invented by studying the Zero, they were validated, refined, and formalized by Eddie Sanders' test flights in the captured aircraft. The Akutan Zero didn't invent the playbook, but it confirmed every page of it. By war's end, Japan had produced roughly 10,500 Zero fighters, the backbone of its aerial forces throughout the Pacific conflict. In contrast, the United States had produced 275 F6F Hellcats in just 37 months, plus thousands of F-4U Corsairs, P-38 Lightnings, P-51 Mustangs, and other fighters. The disparity in production was staggering, and it reflected more than industrial capacity. It represented the tactical and technological edge that the F6F embodied, the end of the Akutan Zero. Fittingly, or perhaps ironically, the Akutan Zero did not meet its end in combat, but in a training accident. In February 1945, on the tarmac of Naval Air Station North Island, an SB-2C Helldiver lost control during taxiing and struck the parked Zero. Its propeller sliced through the aircraft, reducing one of the most important intelligence prizes of the war to scrap metal. Captain William Leonard, a decorated Hellcat pilot who had called the Zero a treasure, salvaged several cockpit gauges from the wreckage. He donated them to the National Museum of the United States Navy. Other fragments were preserved at the Alaska Heritage Museum and the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. The aircraft was gone, but its legacy flew on. It lived in every tactical manual, every training syllabus, and in the hands of every American pilot who entered combat understanding exactly what the Zero could and couldn't do. The young pilot who changed history, Tadayoshi Koga, just 19 years old, died making an emergency landing on Akutan Island. His final flight on June 4, 1942, coincided with the Battle of Midway, perhaps the single most decisive moment in the Pacific War. Koga's body was first buried on Akutan Island, later exhumed in 1947 by the American Graves Registration Service, and moved to Adak Island. In 1953, the Adak Cemetery was excavated again, and 236 remains, likely including Koga's, were returned to Japan for burial. He would never know that his pristine Zero, hidden for weeks in a fog-covered bog, would betray the secrets of an empire. How important was the Akutan Zero? The debate among historians continues to this day. Some argue it was the single most important intelligence windfall of the Pacific War, more valuable than code-breaking even. Others believe that American victory was inevitable, that the Zero's capture simply accelerated trends already in motion. But listen to those who were there. Lieutenant General Masatake Okumiya, a Japanese historian and officer who served in nearly every major naval battle, said that the loss of the Akutan Zero was no less serious than the defeat at Midway. Fighter ace William Leonard called the captured Zero a treasure that unlocked so many secrets at a time when the need was so great. Marine ace Kenneth Walsh, 21, victories to his name, said that intelligence gained from Koga's Zero saved his life multiple times. So where does the truth lie? It lies in balance. The Akutan Zero was not the sole reason the United States won the air war. That victory rested on a foundation of industrial might, technological innovation, superior training, naval strategy, submarine warfare, and yes, code breaking. But the Akutan Zero was a crucial piece of that puzzle. It arrived exactly when needed, at a moment when the Hellcat's design was still being refined, when tactics were still evolving, when pilots were still learning. Without the Akutan Zero, the F6F would still have been a formidable fighter. American production would still have outpaced Japan. Victory would still have come, but perhaps not as quickly, perhaps not as decisively, and perhaps at the cost of more American lives. In the end, the Zero that fell on Akutan became more than a captured aircraft. It became a turning point, a teacher, a symbol. And when the Hellcat took to the skies again and again, it carried with it not just armor, firepower, and a fearless pilot. It carried the knowledge of how to win. The 19-to-1 kill ratio that the F6F Hellcat achieved was no accident. It was the sum of countless variables, all converging with uncanny precision. A fighter aircraft that married agility with armor, speed with survivability, tactical doctrine informed by intelligence and validated through test flights. Training programs that turned rookies into lethal aviators, industrial scale that ensured numerical dominance, and crucially, detailed intelligence on the Zero, gained not through espionage or battlefield capture but by sheer chance. In the fog-wrapped wilderness of the Aleutian Islands together, these elements formed an integrated system that overwhelmed Japanese air power, not just with force, but with understanding, memory, and tribute, the veterans' testimony. In the decades after the war, F6F Hellcat veterans gathered for reunions. Men who had once danced with death above the Pacific now stood shoulder to shoulder, telling stories, honoring comrades, and reflecting on the tools that had helped them survive. They remembered the Akutan Zero. Over and over, pilots spoke of how knowing the Zero's weaknesses gave them an edge not just in tactics, but in confidence. They described executing the very maneuvers Sanders had pioneered: high-speed dives, hard right rolls, vertical escapes. One former ace recalled, "We were told the Zero was invincible. We believed it because we'd seen what it could do. Then we learned its secrets from the plane in Alaska. Suddenly, it wasn't invincible. It was just another aircraft, one we could beat if we flew smart." The Hellcat gave us the tools, he added. The Akutan Zero gave us the knowledge. Together, they gave us victory. After the war, from dominance to obsolescence, the Hellcat remained in frontline service until the war's end, gradually giving way to the F4U Corsair as the latter's carrier landing issues were resolved. After 1945, the Hellcat was quickly phased out, its piston-driven engine unable to keep pace with a new generation of jets. Some found second lives in reserve squadrons, converted into drones, or scrapped. The last active-duty Navy Hellcat retired in 1954, just 9 years after the end of the war. Such was the speed of aviation progress. A fighter at the pinnacle in 1943 was obsolete by 1954, surpassed by jets that flew twice as fast and climbed 3 times as quickly. But the Hellcat's combat record remained unmatched and unforgettable. Preserving the legacy today, museum displays across the United States feature restored F6Fs, some static, some airworthy. They roar to life at air shows, their radial engines growling, silhouettes slicing through the sky like ghosts of the past. Roughly 70 Hellcats survive in museums and private collections. 7 remain airworthy, all in the United States, flown regularly at commemorative events. Each one a flying tribute to the 12,000 aircraft Grumman built, the 34,000 pilots who trained in them, the 5,000-plus enemy aircraft they destroyed. What remains of the Akutan Zero? Very little remains of the physical Akutan Zero. Some gauges, salvaged by William Leonard, now reside in the National Museum of the U.S. Navy. Fragments are preserved at the Alaska Heritage Museum and the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. The rest exists in test reports, engineering diagrams, and the enduring memory of the pilots it helped protect. It never fired a shot in American hands. It never flew a combat mission. It was destroyed not in war, but in a training accident, sliced apart by the propeller of a helldiver on a foggy day in 1945. And yet, its impact echoed louder than any dogfight. Eddie Sanders, and the final transformation, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, the man who first sat behind the controls of the Akutan Zero, lived to see the full arc of the aircraft's legacy. He continued to serve throughout the war, contributing to the development of multiple aircraft. After retiring from the Navy, he entered the aerospace industry, where his deep experience in aircraft testing proved invaluable. He passed away in the 1970s, having witnessed the evolution of naval aviation from fabric-covered fighters to supersonic jets. The world he had helped shape soared higher than he could have imagined when he first sat inside a foreign cockpit, hands trembling slightly on the unfamiliar stick, engine idling, guards watching. One aircraft, one test pilot, one turning point. The story of the Akutan Zero is not one of sheer numbers or firepower. It is a story of timing, of knowledge gained, and of how a single aircraft captured by luck, tested by courage, and studied with relentless precision helped turn the course of history. It was not the reason America won the Pacific War, but without it, victory might have come more slowly, more painfully, and at the cost of more lives. In the end, the Akutan Zero did not belong to the empire that built it. It belonged to every Hellcat pilot who used its secrets to survive, to every engineer who studied its design to improve their own, to every page of every tactical manual that taught how to beat the unbeatable, and to every American who lived because one aircraft fell from the sky and did not burn. The F6F Hellcat's astonishing 19-to-1 kill ratio was no accident of war, no statistical anomaly. It was the culmination of forces meticulously aligned, an aircraft that married speed, firepower, and pilot protection. A tactical doctrine, sharpened by field experience and reinforced by precise intelligence. A training pipeline that produced thousands of competent aviators, an industrial machine capable of outproducing an empire, and one nearly intact aircraft, the Akutan Zero, that revealed the enemy's secrets just when America needed them most. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders rarely spoke of his role. For him, it had simply been one more assignment in a career devoted to naval aviation. But those who understood what he did, those who flew the Hellcat into battle, never forgot. His calm test flights, his careful observations, and his detailed reports laid a foundation that influenced tactical doctrine and validated aircraft design choices at a critical moment. He didn't seek glory, but he delivered something far more enduring, clarity in a time of uncertainty. Lessons beyond the Pacific. The broader lesson of the Akutan Zero and the F6F Hellcat extends far beyond World War II. Modern military planners spend billions on intelligence, threat analysis, and reverse engineering, because this story proved how decisive a single piece of enemy equipment can be. Every captured aircraft, every technical defector, every fragment of enemy doctrine can become another Akutan Zero, a window into the enemy's design philosophy, a crack in the armor of superiority. When properly exploited, that knowledge doesn't just inform, it reshapes the battlefield. Timing, the critical variable, the timing of the Zero's arrival, was everything. Had it crashed a year earlier, its insights might have arrived before the Hellcat's design matured, too early to influence production or tactics. Had it come a year later, it might have been too late, a curiosity in a war already decided by blood and attrition. But in mid-1942, with the F6F design still malleable and the tide of the war still uncertain, the Akutan Zero arrived like a message in a bottle, a gift from fortune that landed in the right hands at the right time. And America made full use of it. Quantity versus quality. And the fusion of both the Zero in 1942 was arguably the best carrier-based fighter in the world. Its agility, range, and performance outmatched anything in the American arsenal, but the Hellcat represented something more. Quality at scale. It was tactically superior. It was easier to fly. It was safer in combat, and crucially, it was available in overwhelming numbers. America didn't just match the Zero, they buried it. The unknown legacy of a 19-year-old pilot, Tadayoshi Koga, who died during an emergency landing on a boggy island in the Aleutians, could never have known that his aircraft so perfectly preserved would help defeat his homeland. His wingman circling above and unwilling to fire on what appeared to be a survivable crash could never have imagined that their compassion would doom thousands of their comrades. And the American recovery crews, knee-deep in Alaskan mud, winching the wreck inch by inch across frozen earth, could not have known they were hauling out the key to air superiority in the Pacific. Even Eddie Sanders, as he gently taxied the alien machine onto the runway in San Diego, could not have known how deeply his test flights would influence doctrine, design, and ultimately, the war. When history hinges on moments, history is shaped not only by grand strategies and massive armies, but by moments when chance meets readiness and preparation exploits opportunity. The Akutan Zero was one such moment, and the F6F Hellcat was its legacy. One captured aircraft, one skilled test pilot, one perfectly timed intersection of intelligence, engineering, and doctrine. Together, they reshaped the Pacific War. They turned the Zero from phantom to target. They gave American pilots not only the machine to fight, but the knowledge to win. And when the Hellcats rose from American decks, they did not carry only bullets and bombs. They carried the ghost of a fallen enemy, the discipline of test pilots, and the lessons of a single, shattered plane. Lessons written in the skies of Akutan and paid for in fire over the Pacific. The story of the Akutan Zero and the F6F Hellcat isn't just a tale of machines and men. It's a timeless case study in how intelligence, adaptability, and timing can transform the trajectory of war. A single aircraft captured by chance, studied by one test pilot, and understood at the right moment, contributed to a weapon system that achieved air dominance across the Pacific. Sometimes, the greatest victories come not through destruction, but through understanding. That closing line of yours could stand as the epitaph for the entire campaign.